Story Survive.
The Music Producer. A journey into underground London's creative revolution. The beginning. Gatwick Airport Terminal, early morning, January 2005. My name is James Chen. I was 26 years old, a music producer with more ambition than experience, and I was about to step into one of the most transformative periods of my life. As I collected my luggage from the carousel, I received a text message from an unknown number. Shoreditch is changing. Move carefully. I stared at it for a long moment. My friend Tom from Manchester had arranged everything: the flat, some initial connections, a few leads on studios. But this message? This wasn't from him. Someone else knew I was arriving. Someone else knew where I was going. I deleted the message and told myself it was probably spam, a misdirected text meant for someone else. But as I walked through the airport terminal, pulling my suitcase behind me, something shifted inside me. A feeling, a warning I couldn't quite explain. What I didn't know then was that this feeling was accurate. I was about to enter a world I didn't understand. A world where music and creativity existed along something far more complex. A world that would change me forever. I took a taxi to Shoreditch with my suitcase and my laptop, completely unaware of what I was walking into. First impressions: Brick Lane and Shoreditch High Street. Morning, January 2005. The taxi pulled up to a converted textile factory on the corner of Brick Lane and Shoreditch High Street. The building was old, genuinely old, with exposed brick and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The ground floor was a curry shop, the smell of turmeric and cardamom already wafting up to the streets. My flat was on the 4th floor. The landlord, Mr. Patel, was a man in his 50s with tired eyes and the kind of weary kindness that comes from renting properties in neighborhoods you no longer recognize. He showed me around the space: a single room barely large enough for a bed and desk, a radiator that clanked ominously, a window that looked out onto the street below. "It's small," I said, understanding this was an understatement. "But it's in the center of everything," Mr. Patel replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he meant more than just geography. As he handed me the keys, he paused. He seemed to be considering something carefully. Then he sat down on the bed and looked at me directly. "You're a musician?" he asked. "A producer, actually. I work with electronic music, but I collaborate with live musicians." He nodded slowly. "I've rented to many musicians over the past few years. Since 2002, maybe. I've seen them come and go. Most are good people. They stay for a year or two, create their work, then move on to bigger opportunities or return home." He was quiet for a moment. I waited. "But some," he continued carefully, "some of them have changed. Not gradually, suddenly. They arrive bright and hopeful, and within months they seem different, worried. And then some of them leave very suddenly, in the middle of the night. They leave behind their deposits, their belongings, sometimes even their keys on the bed." "Where do they go?" I asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Mr. Patel said. "I don't know, but their friends come looking for them. Months later. Not always friendly people. They ask questions. Where is she? Do you have contact information? Do you know where she went?" He stood up. "I'm telling you this because you seem like a thoughtful person. Because you should know that whatever Shoreditch looks like from the street, there are currents underneath. Be aware of them." Then he left me alone in that small room with my suitcase and my confusion. Exploring the neighborhood. Various streets of Shoreditch. Days 1-5 January 2005. Over my first week, I began to understand what Mr. Patel meant. By day, Shoreditch was undergoing rapid transformation. Coffee shops were appearing on streets that had never seen them before. Estate agents' offices opened weekly. Property developers circled like sharks, buying up old warehouses and abandoned factories. The neighborhood was gentrifying at visible speed. But there was another Shoreditch that existed alongside this visible transformation. An underground Shoreditch that revealed itself gradually, carefully, only to people who were paying attention. I'd walk down Kingsland Road and notice small galleries hidden behind unmarked doors. I'd pass warehouses with no signage, no indication of what happened inside, but with groups of people arriving after dark. I'd see artists and musicians moving through the streets with a particular kind of purpose. They knew where they were going, and they were careful about who saw them go. The music venues didn't advertise. Word spread through text messages, through emails sent to carefully maintained lists, through conversations whispered in bars. A show would happen in a basement one night, and unless you were connected to the right network, you'd never know it had occurred. I spent hours in the British Library using their computers to research Shoreditch's history. I learned about its past as a center for textile manufacturing. I learned about the artists and designers who had begun moving here in the 1990s, attracted by cheap rents and industrial spaces. I read about the emerging electronic music scene, the post-punk revival, the visual art collectives. But the deeper history, the story of how the underground creative scene actually functioned, how it was funded, what mechanisms allowed it to exist, that information wasn't in databases or library books. That I would have to learn by living it. The first venue. The Curtain Road, Night Week 1, January 2005. On my 6th night in Shoreditch, loneliness drove me to action. I'd spent 5 evenings in my small room, researching online, listening to music, trying to figure out how to make connections in a city where I knew no one. But isolation has a way of creating desperation. I decided I'd go to a bar, have a drink, and if nothing else, at least be around other human beings. The Curtain on Curtain Road looked ordinary from the outside, just another pub in a rapidly changing neighborhood. Inside, it had the aesthetic of a place that had been designed to look like it hadn't been designed. Exposed brick, mismatched furniture, vintage beer signs on the walls. I ordered a pint and sat in a corner, nursing my drink and observing the other patrons. This was my strategy. Observe first, understand the social dynamics, then attempt connection. Around 11 p.m., something changed in the venue's atmosphere. People who had been sitting casually began to move toward the back of the bar. They moved with a certain purposefulness, as if responding to some signal I hadn't perceived. Curious, I followed them. Behind the main bar area, there was a doorway I hadn't noticed before. It led to a staircase descending into darkness. I could hear music, not from speakers, but actual live instruments. A bass line that seemed to vibrate through the building's foundations. Drums creating complex polyrhythms. Electronics humming underneath everything. I descended the stairs. The basement opened into a space that felt larger than the building above it should have allowed. It was lit by candles, dozens of them, creating dancing shadows on the brick walls. The space was maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a low ceiling that made you feel slightly claustrophobic. Perhaps 50 people filled the space. They weren't dancing or partying in any conventional sense. They were gathered in small groups, talking quietly, observing the musicians with intense focus. The atmosphere was contemplative, almost sacred. The musicians, a turntablist mixing vinyl with electronic effects, a live percussionist playing complex patterns on various instruments, a bass player locked into a groove that felt almost hypnotic, were creating something extraordinary. The music wasn't trying to entertain, it was trying to communicate something. to express something that couldn't be expressed in words. I stood against the wall, completely transfixed for what must have been 40 minutes. When the set ended, the musicians stepped back, the crowd dispersed slowly, and I remained there, trying to process what I'd experienced. A woman appeared beside me. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features, and the kind of presence that made you feel like she was assessing you. She held a drink, but wasn't drinking it. "First time?" she asked. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Because you have the look of someone who's never experienced music like that before. Pure, uncompromised by commercial considerations, created simply because it must be created." "How often does this happen?" I asked. She smiled slightly. "That depends on many things. The musicians have day jobs. The space isn't officially sanctioned. The event exists in a kind of legal gray area. But that's precisely what makes it possible." "What do you mean?" She looked at me carefully, as if deciding whether to continue. "The official Shoreditch, the one gentrifying, the one that will eventually become expensive and mainstream, that requires permits and licenses and insurance. It requires compromise. But the real Shoreditch, the one that's still creating genuine art, exists outside those systems. It exists because no one's looking too carefully. It exists because the people creating it have decided that authenticity matters more than legality." "That sounds risky," I said. "It is," she replied, "which is why you should be careful. The more you see, the more you understand, the more complicated your position becomes. You'll have to decide whether you're willing to be part of something beautiful that exists in ethical gray areas. Not everyone is." She walked away before I could respond, disappearing into the crowd and then up the stairs. I remained in that basement for another hour, trying to understand what had just happened, what I'd witnessed, what I was being invited to become part of. Danny, Bar Kick, Shoreditch High Street, night week 2, 2:30 a.m. I returned to the curtain twice more that week, but the basement was locked. No music, no event, just a sealed door. I began exploring other venues, guided by whispered recommendations and careful questions. I learned about Bar Kick, a video game arcade bar that also hosted live music. I learned about The Stable, a space hidden behind an unmarked door on Scrutton Street. I learned about Brick Lane Gallery, which wasn't actually a gallery, but a massive loft space where multidisciplinary art events occurred. At Bar Kick, on a Thursday night at 2:30 in the morning, I saw someone I recognized from the curtain's basement. He was a turntablist, maybe mid-30s, with intense focus and scarred hands. He was mixing vinyl with electronic equipment, creating soundscapes that were simultaneously aggressive and beautiful. When he finished his set, I approached him. "That was extraordinary," I said. "The way you layered the vinyl with the electronics, the timing was perfect." He looked at me for a long moment. He seemed to be deciding something. Then, "You're not from here." "Manchester. I'm a music producer. Moved here about 2 weeks ago." "Another producer," he said, but without judgment. "Observation. What kind of music?" "Electronic, mostly. But I'm interested in layering live instrumentation underneath, hybrid approaches." He lit a cigarette. We stood in silence for a moment. "I'm Danny," he said finally. "Listen, I'm going to say something, and you need to decide right now whether you want to hear it or not. Because once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. And once you're part of certain things, you can't just walk away without consequences." My pulse quickened. I want to hear it. Danny looked around the bar, ensuring we were relatively alone. Then he lowered his voice. "The creative scene here, the real one, not the sanitized version that's starting to appear in magazines, it exists because of a specific infrastructure. That infrastructure protects the artists, provides funding, creates spaces where people can create without commercial pressure. But that infrastructure has costs, and those costs aren't paid by the artists or the audiences. They're paid by people with very specific interests in having spaces like this exist.
What kind of interests? I asked.
The kind you don't ask about if you want to stay healthy, Danny said. But what you need to understand is this. If you're serious about creating music that matters, you're going to have to accept that the system supporting it isn't clean. It's not illegal in an obvious way. There's no drug dealing happening on the stage, nothing that obvious. But the funding, the infrastructure, the protection that allows this scene to exist, it comes from sources that have other purposes.
I don't understand, I said.
You will, or you won't, and you'll leave. Either way, the scene will continue without you. But if you want to be part of something real, something that's actually pushing the boundaries of what music can be, you're going to have to accept some moral complexity. You're going to have to choose between purity and authenticity. I thought about this. I thought about the music I'd heard in the Curtain's basement. I thought about the way those musicians had played with absolute focus, with absolute commitment to something beyond commercial success.
What do I have to do? I asked.
Introduction to the Underground. Various locations, weeks 2-4, January-February 2005. Danny became my guide into the actual underground. Through him, I met Sarah, a visual artist who'd been in Shoreditch for 3 years and knew every space, every artist, every hidden collective. Through Danny, I met Kieran, a drummer who worked as an electrician by day and played in multiple bands by night. Through Danny, I met Claire, a vocalist with a voice that sounded like it came from another dimension. And Marcus Webb, a producer and musician who seemed to exist slightly outside normal space-time. Danny introduced me to the Stable, a converted horse stable on Scrutton Street that had been transformed into a professional recording studio and performance space. You accessed it through an unmarked industrial door. Inside, exposed brick, professional equipment, an atmosphere that felt sacred. He introduced me to Brick Lane Gallery, a massive loft space in a converted textile factory where Thursday nights, a network of text messages and emails would summon artists, musicians, filmmakers, and visual artists to create collaborative work. The space would host live painting, live music, video projections, poetry readings, all happening simultaneously, all responding to each other in real time. He introduced me to Hackney Wick, a neighborhood even more raw than Shoreditch, where artist collectives operated out of condemned buildings, and where the creative energy felt almost dangerous in its intensity. And slowly, carefully, Danny introduced me to the actual mechanics of how the scene functioned. The venues generate revenue through door fees, he explained over coffee one afternoon. But the artists can't survive on what those door fees provide. The venues can't actually pay for space and equipment and insurance based on 100 people paying £5 each. So the venues have to have other revenue streams.
What kind of revenue streams? I asked.
Danny hesitated. The kind that doesn't show up on official books. The kind that requires spaces where large amounts of cash can change hands without creating a paper trail. The kind that needs to exist in environments where people are comfortable with ethical ambiguity.
You're talking about money laundering, I said quietly.
I'm talking about infrastructure, Danny corrected. Money that needs to move through the economy invisibly, and venues that exist partially outside the official economy. They serve both purposes simultaneously. They're real art spaces, and there's something else. Why are you telling me this? I ask. Because you're good. I've heard your production work. You have talent. And because in a few months, you're going to start getting paid significant amounts of money for production work that doesn't seem to warrant that payment. And when that happens, you need to understand why. You need to understand what you're actually part of. The first major project. Hackney Wick Studio, multiple sessions, February 2005. By mid-February, Danny introduced me to my first real project, an electronic collective called Dirty Electronics. The collective consisted of 4 core members: a turntablist named Marcus, not Marcus Webb, a different Marcus, a percussionist named Yuki who played traditional and contemporary instruments, a synthesizer player named Thomas, and a vocalist named Claire, the same Claire I'd met through Danny. The project was ambitious, a full-length album of electronic music with live instrumentation, blending turntablism, live percussion, synthesized sounds, and haunting vocal lines. The music was genuinely experimental. It wasn't trying to sound like anything that currently existed. It was trying to expand what electronic music could be. The studio where we recorded was in a converted warehouse in Hackney Wick. You accessed it through an unmarked door in an unmarked building. The equipment was professional, far better than a space like this should have possessed. The acoustics were excellent. The space felt like somewhere important happened. For 2 weeks, I worked with this collective, producing and mixing tracks. The process was collaborative and intense. We'd record from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., fueled by coffee and focus. We'd try approaches that didn't work, scrap them, try something completely different. We'd build layers upon layers, creating depth and complexity. The music that emerged was extraordinary. It sounded like the future of electronic music, sophisticated, emotionally resonant, technically innovative without being technically self-conscious. "This is what it's for," Claire said during one of our final sessions, around 4 a.m., when we were all running on fumes, but the music had reached a state of near perfection. All of this, all the spaces, all the infrastructure, all the complexity, it's so that music like this can exist, so that artists can create without thinking about commercial viability, so that we can push the boundaries of what's possible. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. What I didn't want to think about was where the funding came from. What I didn't want to investigate was the mechanisms that made spaces like this possible. What I didn't want to acknowledge was that beauty might be built on foundations I wasn't willing to examine too closely. The second warning. James's flat, evening week, 5 February 2005. I'd been in Shoreditch for about 4 weeks when the second warning came. I was in my small room working on a mix when there was a knock on my door. It was unusual. Visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors were unprecedented. I opened the door to find Alice, the photographer I'd encountered on the street weeks earlier. She looked different than she had before. She looked frightened. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She entered the small room and closed the door behind her. "I need to tell you something," she said, "because I think you're heading toward a decision point, and you should have information before you make that decision." "What kind of information?" I asked. "There was a girl," Alice said. "Sophie. She was part of the Shoreditch scene. She was dating Danny, actually. She was an artist, installations, video work, really interesting stuff. She arrived about 2 years ago from Leeds. She was brilliant and dedicated, and she seemed like she was going to be part of the scene for a long time." Alice paused, seeming to gather herself. About 8 months ago, Sophie started asking questions. She wanted to understand how the venues were actually funded. She wanted to know where the money was coming from. She thought maybe it was grant money, Arts Council support, things like that. But as she investigated, she started realizing that the money wasn't clean. She started realizing that she was part of a system that was more complex than just artists supporting artists. "What happened?" I asked, though I was fairly certain I didn't want to know the answer. She told Danny she wanted out. She said she was going to the police. She was going to tell them what she knew about the funding, the infrastructure, all of it. She was scared, but she felt like she had to do it. It was a matter of conscience.
Alice stopped. The silence hung between us.
"And then?" I prompted. "And then she disappeared. 3 months ago. Just vanished. Her flat was packed up. Her landlord said her friend came and collected her things. But nobody's seen Sophie. Nobody knows where she went. Her family's been trying to find her. Her friends have posted on social media. But it's like she just ceased to exist." I felt cold, despite the warmth of my room. "You're saying something happened to her?" "I'm saying that people who ask too many questions, who threaten to expose the infrastructure, who try to leave, they disappear. And I'm telling you this because you're starting to become important to the scene. You're producing good work, you're talented, and you're at a point where you can either go deeper or step back. But you need to understand what's going deeper means." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why put yourself at risk?" Alice looked at me directly. "Because I'm trying to figure out what happened to Sophie. Because I'm documenting everything. Because someone needs to have a record. And because I think you might be able to help me understand what's actually happening here." Marcus Webb. Hackney Wick Studio, Deep Night, Week 6, mid-February 2005. Danny took me to meet Marcus Webb at a studio I'd never been to before. It was accessed through a building in Hackney Wick that looked abandoned from the outside. We climbed 6 flights of stairs through corridors that smelled like rust and decay. At the top, a locked door with no marking. Danny knocked. 3 times. Pause. Twice more. The door opened. Marcus Webb was in his late 50s or early 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd lived intensely. His eyes were sharp and intelligent. He gestured for us to enter. The studio inside was state-of-the-art. Professional mixing desk, high-end monitors, recording equipment that must have cost tens of thousands of pounds. But what caught my attention was the cot in the corner and the young man sleeping on it. "That's Tommy," Marcus said, following my gaze. "He's a musician, extraordinarily talented, but he's struggling with addiction." I could see track marks on Tommy's arms. He looked like he'd been through something that had aged him beyond his apparent years. "The funding that supports the scene," Marcus continued, not bothering with pleasantries, "comes from sources that require money to be moved invisibly through the economy. The venues provide perfect cover. Cash comes in, cash goes out, and nobody asks questions because everyone's focused on the art. But the money has to come from somewhere, and where it comes from creates consequences." Marcus gestured for me to sit. "Tommy's consequences," he continued, "his addiction is a direct result of the money that funds his musical development. The same sources that pay for studios, that fund venues, that allow artists to exist without commercial pressure, those sources also create situations like Tommy's. People get hurt. People get pulled into systems they can't escape." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because you're at a decision point. You can pretend you don't know how the system works. You can keep producing music and accept the money and not think too carefully about where it comes from. That's the option most people choose. Or you can understand what you're part of. You can make an informed choice, and then you live with that choice." Marcus paused. He looked at Tommy sleeping on the cot. "The question isn't whether the system is clean," Marcus said. "The question is whether you're willing to live with the contradiction. Whether you can create beauty knowing that it's built on foundations that create suffering. Whether you're comfortable with that moral complexity." "And if I'm not?" I asked. "Then you leave. You go back to Manchester. You create nothing that matters. You remain pure and irrelevant." He let that sink in. "So what do you choose?" he asked. I thought about Sophie. I thought about Tommy. I thought about the extraordinary music I'd been creating. I thought about the basement at the Curtain. I thought about Claire's voice. I thought about the future of electronic music being created in spaces that shouldn't exist. "I'm staying," I said. Marcus nodded. It wasn't approval exactly, more like acknowledgement. "Then understand this," he said. "The people funding this infrastructure aren't artists. They're not interested in music for its own sake. They're interested in having spaces where money can move invisibly. The art is real, the creativity is real, but it exists as a side effect of something else. And if you become too much of a problem, if you ask too many questions or try to expose what's happening, you become a liability, and liabilities are removed." Deeper into the system. Various locations, weeks 6-8, February, March 2005. Everything accelerated after my meeting with Marcus Webb. I was introduced to more people, more projects, more funding appeared. I was offered cash payments that seemed disproportionate to the work I'd done. I was invited to recording sessions in spaces I'd never known existed. The money was strange, sometimes thousands of pounds for a few days of work. Other times, nothing for weeks, then a massive payment would appear. The randomness and excess told me exactly what Danny and Marcus had been hinting at. This wasn't normal music industry payment. This was something else. I produced tracks for a collective focused on ambient electronic music that seemed to exist primarily in private performances for select audiences. I mixed an album for a post-punk revival band that had connections I didn't ask about. I collaborated with experimental musicians whose day jobs I never learned. The music was uniformly excellent. The artists were uniformly brilliant. But the infrastructure supporting them was uniformly questionable. By late February, I was making more money than I'd ever made in my life. By mid-March, I'd created more significant music than I'd created in the previous 5 years. But I was also increasingly aware that I'd become part of something I didn't fully understand and couldn't easily leave. Alice's investigation. Alice and I began spending time together, ostensibly to discuss what she was investigating about Sophie's disappearance, but also because there was something between us that was becoming harder to ignore. She showed me her photographs, thousands of them, images of the Shoreditch scene, musicians performing in basements, artists creating in hidden spaces, the community that existed underneath the visible gentrification. But she also showed me other photographs, images of people who looked connected to the infrastructure, men in expensive suits appearing at venues, money changing hands, conversations in corners that looked significant. "I'm trying to build a picture," Alice explained. "I'm trying to understand the network. Sophie was involved with someone, not Danny, someone she met through the scene who had connections to the funding. And once she realized what was happening, once she tried to leave, she disappeared. What happened to her?" I asked. "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I know this, she's not the first person to disappear. There's a pattern. Artists, musicians, people who ask too many questions or try to leave, they vanish. And the scene just continues without them. New people arrive, new talent emerges. Life goes on." "That's horrifying," I said. "Yes," Alice agreed, "but it's also the mechanism that keeps the scene pure. Removing people who threaten the system, removing voices that might expose the infrastructure, that's part of what maintains the authenticity of what's being created. It's horrible and efficient." The choice. James's flat, late night, early March 2005. I sat in my small room, the curry shop smell rising through the floorboards, and I understood that I had to make a decision. I could continue as I was, creating extraordinary music, making significant money, living in a community of brilliant artists. I could accept that I didn't understand the full picture and probably shouldn't try to. I could live with the contradiction. Or I could help Alice investigate. I could try to understand what had happened to Sophie. I could potentially expose the infrastructure. I could try to be part of a solution rather than part of a problem. But I also understood that the second choice came with serious risks. Not hypothetical risks, real risks. People disappeared. That wasn't metaphorical. My phone buzzed. A text from Danny. Session tomorrow, 9 p.m. The stable. We're recording something special. I looked at that message. I thought about everything I'd learned, everything I'd experienced, everything I'd become part of. I thought about Sophie. I thought about Tommy on that cot. I thought about the extraordinary music. I thought about the infrastructure of beauty built on unseen suffering. And I made a decision. I would stay. I would continue creating. But I would also help Alice. I would document what I could. I would try to understand. I would exist in the contradiction, holding both the beauty and the horror simultaneously. It was a decision I'd spend the rest of my life living with. Descent. The Stable, Scrutton Street Night, early March 2005. The session at the stable was different from previous sessions. The collective was the same: turntablist, percussionist, synthesizer player, vocalist. But there were additional people present, men I'd never seen before, men whose presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Marcus Webb was there, observing from the shadows. Danny introduced me briefly. This is James. He's our new producer. He's solid. One of the men nodded. He was perhaps 40, with expensive clothes and the kind of bearing that suggested authority. "Show us what you can do," he said. The session began. The musicians played with absolute focus, creating layers of sound that built into something genuinely transcendent. I worked at the mixing desk, shaping the sound, emphasizing certain frequencies, creating depth and space. 2 hours later, when it was finished, the man who'd spoken before approached me. "Good work," he said. "You understand what you're doing." "Thank you," I said. "You understand what this is?" he asked. "A recording session," I said carefully. "It's a demonstration," he corrected. "A demonstration of what's possible when you have genuine talent, genuine resources, and genuine commitment. These musicians are extraordinary, and they're going to continue creating extraordinary work, and in exchange, certain requirements will be met." I didn't ask what requirements. I was learning that asking questions was a way to create problems. "You're part of this now," he continued. "You've created work with these artists. You've been paid. You're complicit. That's not a threat. That's just information, so that you understand your position." He handed me an envelope. Cash, thousands of it. "That's for today's work," he said, "and for your discretion regarding today's work, regarding all of this. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. "Good. Welcome to the real underground, James, the one where the stakes actually matter."